with respect to the $5 million over, so help me remember, in 18-19, how much Measure Z money went into building the reserves?
In 18-19 was helped to cover the operational shortfall. Christy, do you have that numbers like about 13 million? About 13 million of Measure Z goes towards the general fund. And about 18 million in 19-20.
So 5 million of that 13 million of Measure Z money that went into the general fund operations that are now coming to the bottom line here are in essence going to public pensions.
Well, you could make the same argument for sales tax. You could say it argues for PD. You could use that for any revenue source.
I understand, but we may not have agreed a year ago to that $13 million number if we knew there was going to be a $5 million surplus over the 20% target, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question I can't answer.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. Thanks.
John Lyle, Ward 4. Adam, I don't remember seeing anything like this with such a dire out-year forecast when we were, voting on Measure Z things. Is this something new or,
No.
As we go forward, the idea of across-the-board cuts don't work. I don't think they work now, and
Right.
You've clearly varied from that where you'd work through that through those discussions and conversations, and so I certainly applaud that. They're a great way to put some things in perspective and get some rough order of magnitude, but they simply don't work.
Correct.
The city has to prioritize the components of its mission and align the budget then to those priorities. And certainly given the numbers you shared earlier or reshared earlier tonight, updated tonight, we simply have to, future conversations really have to start with what's our mission, what's our critical elements of that and our priorities, and the only way to balance the budget going forward will be to shed some very dearly held long-term commitments that we've had as a community. And does the council understand that?
I think the council, when we went to the city council and talked about the 5 years, they understand sort of the brevity that's there. I think having them in their community meetings and sort of hearing it again for the second time and firsthand, and I appreciate those of you that came out. And I think, all the groups we've talked to, the employee groups understand. They understand what's coming. There's not a day that goes by that there's not an article in some newspaper in the state of California addressing this somehow.
Absolutely.
And so I think there's a consensus, not only among employees and elected officials, but groups such as this, that cities and counties in the state of California are approaching a pretty critical juncture here. And so, which is why it's so important that we look at these things 5 years at a time and develop a plan to address these. Is it going to be a pretty plan? No. Okay, so I'm going to go through a quick presentation, hopefully to provide some context for the information that is before you and what we are asking of you this evening. Let's see if I can turn this the right way. So quickly, we're going to talk about our 5-year spending plan. Our 1 cent sales tax item remains the same. That item's in your packet. We're not recommending any changes to those items. An update on the reserve, an update on staff's proposed items to close the shortfall in 18-19, 19-20, and then a priority of unfunded needs, and we'll talk about why that's important. So the 5-year spending plan. This is a summary of the 5-year spending plan that was already presented to this group. This is the net of the revenues and expenditures, assuming that the items before you, staff's proposed items to close the shortfall, are approved or in those amounts. What we wanted to show you were two things. One, that the shortfall, we'd have a small surplus in year 1, which would be carried forward to year 2 to address some of the shortfall in year 2. You'll notice that we estimated $3 and $6 million. We've increased those to 4 and 7 to cover some increased staff costs as it relates to the class and compensation. But what we wanted to talk in this group, and we get the question a lot, is why do you have a shortfall? What is the number one driver? And so we talked a lot about this group, and we talked about this morning with the chamber, was that the city CalPERS costs are increasing. The unfunded accrued liability that we have as a city is currently about $603 million. We're paying it back over a 30-year period. You saw an email last night where any new increases will be paid for over 20 years. So the UAL, if we look at cumulative increases from our current year in 17-18 through the remainder, you will notice that almost the entirety of the shortfall can be attributed to the increases in those pension costs as relates to the unfunded liability. It does match up pretty well, and again, as revenues flatten and CalPERS costs continue to increase, the vast majority of the increase is coming from this unfunded accrued liability. So there is sort of our estimated shortfall.